Hello and welcome to episode 12 of Election Countdown. I'm joined here today by my own dissertation tutor, Allister McGregor, who's going to talk to us today about poverty in politics. Professor, since the beginning of the Tory government in 2010, we've seen a marked rise in poverty in the UK. How much of this has been down to both either Tory cuts or through the failure of the free market as a whole?
I think the effects of the 2008 crisis have been very significant. So the extent of depression in markets, the extent to which the state has had to, here in the UK, has had to kind of effectively prop up the economy and particularly parts of the banking system, has been very significant. And when you put that alongside austerity policies, then I think you've got a double force that has exacerbated poverty since that time.
Do you think since the beginning of austerity and Tory policies, we have in effect become desensitised to the effects that austerity has had?
I think there's something strange has been happening in respect to poverty in the UK, in as much as that we just don't see it. Now, whether that's because we don't want to see it, or whether the media thinks it's not a good thing to see or to cover, then I do think we've got an issue that the kind of difficulty and the hardships that people are facing, have been facing and trying to cope with, is not something that we've paid much attention to. So for many people, I think in the UK, there's a sense in which it's, well, there's no great problem here, because we're just not seeing it. It takes somebody like Ken Loach to make a film, like Daniel Blake, to try and bring that back into the spotlight. But it's not something that we're paying attention to.
Do you think we've had the same effect globally as we have had at home, in that people have just grown to accept that there will always be poverty in the world?
Well, there are some big movements in the world to try and deal with poverty. So the Sustainable Development Goals, before that the Millennium Development Goals. I mean, poverty in many parts of the world is much more clearly harmful, causing death, causing stunting of children. So it becomes a much more apparent thing. But my long-term concern is that it just becomes part of business as usual, that we somehow accept that poverty is an inevitable feature and that we can try and do our best, but actually it's a very hard thing to deal with. I don't accept it's either part of business as usual. I don't think it's reasonable in most societies, and I don't think it's something that we can't deal with, but we've not done so.
Again, going back to the media, do you think it's a case of it's been framed as this argument of, well, at home they're all scroungers and abroad they're mainly these migrants who are, trying to come into our country? Is there kind of victimisation of the poor?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there is. I think, there's quite a lot of sensationalist coverage of welfare dependence. There has been in the UK, in the UK media. So I think that's had a very, bad effect. It doesn't really paint the kind of dignity of people who are actually, the vast majority of people who are trying to actually work their way through the difficulties. And in terms of overseas issues, in terms of issues of migration, I think it's incredibly inhumane when you think of some of the contexts from which these people are fleeing and coming, whether that's conflict, whether it's political oppression. The sense that we only see them as a problem is particularly sad, and it's particularly sad that that's the case among people who are poor in the UK, that we've got to that point.
Do you think, in terms of coming onto politics and people like Jeremy Corbyn, who have campaigned against poverty, and certain elements of the left. Do you think that the way that people like Corbyn have been demonised is all part of a sort of class warfare against people that speak out against poverty and against people that stand up for people who can't fight for themselves?
I'm not sure it's a class warfare thing. I think there is a tremendous amount of pushback now, and particularly in the UK, to people who say that we can actually do things differently. We've all been tremendously kind of brainwashed to think that there is only really one solution, and that's to do with, it's to do with markets. They provide all the things that make us, happy. They can provide even our health care. They can provide our transport. And I think there's a great sense of defence in the mainstream that then makes it very difficult to kind of raise these alternatives. I'm not sure it kind of cuts down easily into a kind of class warfare thing, although it's very easy then to sort of paint somebody like Corbyn as, the loony left, as if it were all, entirely proven to be non-credible, which it's obviously not, because it's happening, and some of the things that he's proposing are actually happening quite successfully in other parts of the world.
Coming onto the election, do you think Brexit has been an almost distraction from things like poverty, which Corbyn has continually tried to raise?
I don't think it's a distraction, because I think the Brexit vote and the feeling for Brexit actually say a lot about poverty and exclusion and disconnection in the UK. So it's no surprise then that some of the poorest communities are communities that strongly voted for Brexit. I think it's a real sense of searching around for ways out of the difficulty. And this somehow was offered, that the European Union was the source of our problems. It was the root cause behind the migration issues. It was somehow the cause of us losing control over our economy and so on and so forth. So it's not quite a distraction, but the way that Theresa May is using that as the platform on which people are being asked to make a decision, I think that's a problem. I think the issue's not a problem, and maybe Corbyn has not quite been clear enough in making the connection between the kind of issues on poverty and a more fair and just society and the Brexit issue. But I find it, I think the May attempt to restrict the agenda to that and sort of say, strong and stable. We need somebody like her negotiating for us in Europe. I think it's entirely fallacious, but it's a difficult bubble to burst.
Well, it's better for the political right to channel people's anger into Brexit rather than looking at the real causes of things like austerity and the financial crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's absolutely the case that it draws attention away from the issues of, well, why is this happening? Is austerity, the austerity that we've been having, is that the only way to deal with it? So I do think it is a way of, in that sense, it is a way of channeling people's attentions onto something that stops them looking at the more kind of structural analysis that Corbyn's talking to and the policies are meant to address.
What are your predictions for this election? Do you think it's as bad for Labour as people make out? Do you think the distraction of Brexit has worked?
I would like to believe not, but realistically, I'm not seeing any breakthrough in the narrative. I think Corbyn is looking, much more credible, sensible, and people are hearing more of what he's saying. And I think the manifesto, with its rather, its wide range of radical proposals, I think is, I think it's a good shot. But I think it's failing to kind of break down the kind of mass of focus on Brexit. And I think just to add in respect of Scotland, I think the Labour Party in Scotland, unfortunately, kind of lost the plot, and they lost the plot back before the Scottish referendum. And there's not going to be an easy recovery from that. So in terms of that being a large part of a kind of Labour vote, that's not going to rally round. Although I think many of the values that Sturgeon is proposing sort of sit fairly well with those that Corbyn are proposing. And but clearly they can't be seen to be doing, or at least Corbyn can't be seen to be doing business before the election, because it undermines the Scottish Labour position.
Do you think that Corbyn can rally those that politically have been left behind, particularly the non-voters and working class people who have found that in the days since the Labour Party moved to the centre, haven't really had a voice on these kind of issues?
I don't think an election campaign is long enough to do it, unfortunately. I think what this people, this sense of a group of people who've been left behind, it's a long-term failure of the Labour movement. It's a long-term failure to have really got out there and engaged with people who were in effect, losing their position in society, losing, sort of security of work, losing a sense of their own identity in England, for example. I think there's been a kind of long-term failure that unfortunately an election campaign period can't put right, so it's a long haul.
So if the left are going to have success with the Labour Party, is it going to have to be a project that takes years in the making?
Yeah, if the Labour Party can get its act together to do that. But the tensions in the Labour Party and the profound splits between the Corbyn group and a large number of long-standing Labour Party members in Parliament and in the country, I think is quite critical, and there seems to be no route or path to resolving that. So a failed election will mean ructions in the Labour Party in England, and then whether they can actually get some kind of programme moving forward for the long term, we'd have to wait and see how that worked.
Professor Allister McGregor, thank you very much. Tomorrow at around 1:30 I'll be live streaming my interview with Natalie Bennett. But for all those concerned, thank you very much for watching.
Thanks, Kim.